Ever know someone who seems to know just about everyone? Someone who has a way with people. Maybe it's her reassuring smile. Maybe it's because people know she's sincere. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because she works at Reading Cooperative Bank. Reading Cooperative Bank. We're all yours.
May 2006. Welcome to another edition of Reading at Large, a monthly television magazine produced for RCTV. I'm Dick Curtis, your host for the program. Laurel Hill Cemetery has been the site of Memorial Day exercises here in Reading for many years as residents gather to honor those who have defended our nation. If you like Reading's antiquity, you'll love this farmhouse on Franklin Street, which also once served as the address for a thriving business. House lots are in demand in Reading, but this land has been preserved in its natural state for future generations. John Surratt gives us a preview of one of his future productions. All this on Reading at Large. The monument at Laurel Hill Cemetery, where the Memorial Day exercises take place, was originally called the Civil War Monument. It was dedicated to the sons of Reading who died for their country in the Great Rebellion. Today it is often referred to as the Soldiers' Monument. The cemetery got its name, Laurel Hill, in 1873. Although the cemetery dates back to the early days of the village. You'll find many Revolutionary War heroes here. As the town grew, there was a need for additional space, so a new cemetery was opened up off Forest Glen Road. The land was purchased in 1924, and development started in 1935. Additional land was purchased on Charles Street in 1964, and the Charles Lawn Cemetery opened in 1982. In 1993, the town purchased land off Franklin Street for still a fourth cemetery. The Veterans Memorial on Lowell Street near the entrance to the Laurel Hill Cemetery was dedicated in 1939. It honors local veterans who have died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. This home on Franklin Street was built around 1711 for Joseph Parker. It's one of perhaps 3 or 4 of the oldest houses in Reading. But the building has another interesting story. It was the home of Red Farm Studios, created by Ellen Nelson, a Reading artist.
My parents, Fred and Ellen Nelson, bought the farm in 1941 from my grandmother, Emma Nelson. And we moved in and they renovated to make the farm more comfortable, but kept the old lines. The house was built in 1711 and was bought in 1851 by my great-grandfather. And my grandmother was born here, and then my dad was born here, and my brother and I were brought up here. This is Red Farm Studio, where the Red Farm Studio cards originated. My mother had a gallery for paintings and also her art studio and easel where she designed were in the other end of the room. This is the gallery where my mother had her oil paintings displayed, and people could come in and purchase them. This part of the house was the old carriage shed, and where we're standing is where the front doors opened up to the driveway and the carriages were brought in. Of course, it's been so renovated now that it's hard to imagine. And that part up there was just green and storage and just general tools and that sort of thing. My mother started the business of her figurines, and I think she must have had probably 40 or 50 of them. They were sold to gift shops, and she had sales reps that did take them around, and they, shops would order them, and they were sold all over the country. And they were packed in hay. My father used to help her pack them, and we had the commodity right here on the farm, and they were packed in hay. Every figurine had a name, and on the back, it's printed. And she signed all the figurines on the bottom with her name and the copyright. And this is Titi, and this is Teeny, the two little Dutch people. And this is Tinky and Sue. And my brother had the nickname of Tinky. You can imagine what that brought. She continued that until 1947, when she started to do the Christmas cards for Red Farm Studio. And at that point, dropped the line of figurines. This area is where my mother had her easel and did all her artwork and designed the Red Farm Studio cards. Red Farm Studio started in 1947, and she continued until 1958, when it had grown too large for her to handle. She at that point sold it to Cardinal Card in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and they retained her name of Red Farm Studio, and she was art director for another 10 years for them, and produced the majority of the cards for their line at that time. They still, to this day, retain Red Farm Studio name. She designed other things other than cards for Red Farm Studio. She did a line of coloring books that were really for adults to color for framed pictures for children's room. And she did note cards, and she did wrapping paper, and a couple of cookbooks, numerous things of that line that she illustrated. Some more of my mother's artwork. This was actually the old barn that was taken down for antique timbers a number of years ago. It had to either be repaired or taken down, and they chose to remove it. And it was attached to the barn that's there now. This is a fireplace that my dad built. He loved this corner, and he would sit out here many an evening and have himself a cozy fire. And his last days were spent here too. When he couldn't get around any longer, he had a bed right here. And his greatest desire was to die in his own home, and he did. My dad was a mason contractor and built this fireplace as well as the one in the house and the chimney. And I'm sure there are many people in Reading that have fireplaces that he has built. This is another fireplace that my dad built and put the old Dutch oven in on this side. Originally, the Dutch oven was on the other side of the wall where the kitchen stove, the black kitchen stove, heated it. There was no fireplace here when we moved in, and I don't remember one when I was a little girl and visited my grandparents. There was always a big potbelly stove here, and it fed into the chimney. My dad built this barn in 1956, mainly to store his equipment, his tractors, his dump truck, and whatever else. My mother's business was building up, and by the time he got the barn finished, she took over this part for her shipping room and her inventory storage, leaving him a little end of it for a few pieces of equipment. After she sold the business in 1957, she really started to paint fine art, and she exhibited the Rockport Art Association, and she at the Wenham Tea House she had a private one-man show and numerous functions like that.
Ellen Nelson and I were both charter members for the Reading Art Association. That's where I first met her. I had heard about her and her paintings and her abilities and so on and so forth. And she was a great lady, a really nice person, and very, very talented.
My mother worked in many mediums. Her favorite was oils for many years. And then she had to go to watercolors because she became so allergic to the oils.
Several women, and one of them was Ellen, that were painters, and they loved to paint, but they didn't have any place to show anything. They weren't an organized group. They just got together every now and then and did their thing. And they finally convinced a number of people that we should have an art association. We had meetings and shows in the Reading Art Association. She, for about 10 or 12 years in a row, she won the most popular prize. Every year, you could almost depend upon her doing it, because her paintings were so good and they appealed to almost everybody.
This is her very last watercolor, actually her last painting. And I told my dad that's the one painting I really wanted to have. She was going blind at this point in her life, and the colors are very muted compared to what they used to be in her earlier paintings. In 2002, my mother passed away, and then in 2004, at nearly 102, my dad passed away. This is the last land that goes with the farm. My dad used to farm this all the way down to the pines, as did my grandfather before him. It was farmland up until the late 80s. At that point, he was just haying it. But before that, when I was young, he grew corn, and he grew potatoes. And at one point in the 40s, we had victory gardens, and people from all over town had a little plot of land where they came to grow their vegetables. The farm originally was 28 acres. And in the late 60s, my dad developed Pasture Road. And once he sold the lots on that to individual builders, he developed Blueberry Lane. And he put in the roads and the sidewalks, and that was what his job was. And then he sold the lots to individuals and individual builders. The land had been sold as 2 house lots over a year ago. And after the builder applied for building permits, conservation came in and said that it was wetlands and it can't be built on. And that has interfered with the sale of the house. My dad farmed that land and his father before him. And it's just a period of years that has made it what they call man-made wetlands. And it's just because there is no place for the water to drain now. And unfortunately, it can't be built on. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of property. And it's too bad that a small piece of wetlands can endanger a 1711 house.
Clayton Jones from the Historical Commission points out the historical value of the farmhouse.
This house is quite unique in Reading. It's what's called a half house. It was built in the first 100 years of America's settlement, and the first people to come to this part of Reading chose this plot of land right here, high on a hill, near a little water stream, and they built what's called this half house, where a young couple would build this one-room wide, one-room deep house. There would have been a chimney on the right side and a doorway where that far bottom window is. And then in anticipation of expanding, they would have built another half on the other side. Well, they never did. So 300 years later, we have this unique specimen called a half house. What's worth knowing about a house like this is that it was built before there were architects. It was basically designed and built by a craftsman, a carpenter, and his assistant, a joiner. Up to around 1720, houses were built just by the workmen, without any input from a designer. It's likely that the craftsmen who built this house might have come from England or were the sons of English carpenters. And they had a guild and just passed on the knowledge. It was not written down how to build a house like this. It was something you were just taught. And it was often secret knowledge. So everybody had their own different style. You'll notice that the roof is very steep. That's indication this house came from a design in England where they used thatch roof. Well, in New England, the weather's just too stormy for thatch. But the carpenters kept building the roofs with a steep pitch like this. Here we're on the second floor of this house, and look at this beam. It's probably 14, 15 feet long. It's probably 12 inches by 9 inches. It's probably either chestnut or oak. We're on the second floor. Imagine trying to lift this before there were mechanical cranes to lift this. How would you do this? How would you lift a timber that would probably take 4 men even just to lift off the ground and get it up here 3 stories? There's no real record of how they did that. We know how, let's say, the Amish do it today, and there's been new ways of assembling houses like this, but we have no record of how these timbers were raised so high. It's almost like the ancient pyramids. What's possible about the first owner of this house is that he was a Puritan. And as Puritans, this house has a very austere style to it. It's very almost masculine in its boldness. We have these very large timbers here. But despite that Puritan ethic, the carpenters did allow themselves a little bit of decoration. And we can see it right here on these timbers. But right here is a little carved edge, a little decoration. It was the mark that the carpenter left behind to say, I've been here. Not only did I just cut this beam, but I carved delicately around what's called a bead on the corner here. And that was about as much decoration as the Puritans would allow. Let's look at this door for a sec. It's probably not an original door, but it's an interesting door. It's a plank door. See these planks? And the planks are held together by these cross pieces. And what's interesting really about this door is what's called a strap hinge, which comes into this, what's called a butterfly hinge here. This is almost unique to Reading. There's only a few houses that have these old hinges. And the strap goes across here. And then down here we have the old thumb latch. These styles of this hardware changed over time. This style probably goes back to the early 1700s. The reason we're in this attic is to show you what probably the rest of the house looked like, which has been altered below. But here in the attic, we still see the wide pine floors. They're maybe 12, 13, maybe 15 inches wide. These are very hard to find today. They're also very solid pine, and they take a lot of beating from foot traffic. They're also very long. They're probably 16 feet long, and they're probably about 3/4 inch. They're very straight. There's very few knots. The reason that's hard to find today is that forests just aren't plentiful like this to find that width or breadth of board. We're seeing a real old piece of Reading right here, 300 years old. This house was built with these giant beams made of the hardwoods that grew in Reading, hand-hewn with an axe, probably sometime during the winter, then erected in the summer. These are the rafters. Through the rafters are the purlins. This house has been largely untouched for 300 years. What's holding this purlin in is this wooden nail coming through here. That's usually made of ash, made from a local tree here in Reading. There were many sawmills in Reading, but these timbers were still done by hand. And what happened during the assembly of this house is these timber frames members were assembled out on the ground, and then there were little marks with Roman numerals on each one. So when they brought them up here, they knew exactly where this piece would go here. Because the timbers were so irregular, they had to match them on the ground before they brought them up here. What we're seeing here is the studs of the house, and these are very sturdy timbers, and they're mortised into this thick rafter, and then on this outside part of the stud, you had these wide sheathing boards nailed in, and these are the original sheathing boards from 300 years ago. This attic, or what at the time would have been called a garret, was used to store food, especially corn. Corn was very valuable, didn't want it to be stolen, and corn and herbs could be dried here over the winter and then used. Up here we have a pole going across the rafters with the strings, and this is an interesting artifact that's left in the house. It's likely that those strings were used to hold herbs or other produce from the garden to dry during the course of the winter. So we're very fortunate to still have a half a dozen or so houses like this, designed before there was architects, designed and built by craftsmen, still standing today, built of the timbers from the trees that grew in Reading in the virgin forest.
Kirchen Woods off Franklin Street is now part of the conservation land. John Surratt toured the land with Bob Kirchen, son of Harry Kirchen, who formerly owned the land.
My dad's wishes were to, leave 36 acres that would, still had the birds and the flowers and the lady slippers and all the things that were growing here for all those years. Just leave it there. So it ended up 36 acres of conservation, and I think the town has received 10 more, I think. So there's almost 50 acres there of conservation land. Before he died, he was interested in the people coming and visiting and walking on the land and seeing all the different plants that were there. We sold it in 1974, and he lived to 1986. He was able to see people come and walk on the property and meet people and that. He was always interested in plants. He had his own greenhouse, and we planted a lot of plants out there. Cowslips and stuff like that in the swamp. That's an arrowhead that I found when my dad was plowing the garden years ago. I took it to the Museum of Science, and they authenticated that it's an arrowhead. All right, the Boy Scouts built this walkway so you could enter without getting your feet wet. We had a huge well, and there's a big tank down in the ground, and we used to irrigate about 1.5 acres of garden here. And I had a huge pump here. And if you look over there, you can just see the T-pipe sticking up. But there's a river down under there, and when we dug that, if you lay down on the ground, you could hear the river flowing underneath there, and it's rushing, even in the dead of summer. Like in 1955, when we had the dry summer, we still had water in that well. We pumped over 700 gallons a minute out of that to irrigate the garden. This hollow here was a little house when I was a kid. And they had, she had a garden, and for years, the lilies used to come up and the flowers came up. It's too early in the spring now, but last time I came, some of them still come up. But there was a little cabin in here, and those people came in the summer to enjoy the peace and quiet of the sticks of Reading. There was a big well. There was a well, and it was dug out around maybe 12, 15 feet wide, and it went down to a lower spot, and then it went down and was a well, and we'll walk up further, and his house was right up here, and he was a squatter, and he lived here the latter part of his life. When I was a kid, he was still alive. He had a big garden in here. None of these trees were here. And he had raspberry patch and strawberries, and, well, we weren't allowed to raid the garden. It's small. He had quite a family. His porch came out to here. The house was just a little, you know, like one room. And then on the other side of it, down in that area, there's a big cranberry bog there. And they used to pick cranberries on it. And I'll take you up to where the brook starts. There's a brook that flows through, and they regulated the height of the water. And they could, you know, flood the bog up if it was going to be a cold night so the cranberries wouldn't get frosted, and then drain it down to pick them. And there was another cranberry bog on the other end, and the land was used, you know, I mean, they used it to cut ice on it and everything. It was quite interesting at that time. This brook flowed from a cranberry bog in that direction into another cranberry bog in that direction. And there were little dams along here, and if you could look along in here, there were 3 cutouts, not very deep, and they used to run the water into them in the winter and let them freeze, and then they cut ice, and they would drag the ice out of here and put it in a pit that had sawdust in it, and the ice would last all summer. From Texas to Maine, this is a gas line under here, but they had a blast all the way through here. I think that was 1957 that they came through. And they came through here. They had they just cut trees and everything. They 50-foot wide right away. And my father's property was a rectangle, and they went right across the longest part of it. It was quite a thing to see them lay the pipe. They had a never-ending, looked like a merry-go-round, a carousel, and it dug, and they blasted in front of it. And then right behind it, they had a pipe, and they welded it all together. And then they had this funny machine that had a tar or something, and it actually wound around every section of pipe and came to the weld and stopped until they welded it, and then kept going. And then they laid it down in the ground. There's a brook that comes out underneath the roots of a tree. It flows right here. It flows all year round, and when we were kids, we used to drink it. When it comes out from under this tree. After they blasted around here, that started to run. That's been running since 1950s, and even in the dry of the summer, if you come and pull the leaves away, there's still a little trickle flowing out from under that tree. Bill Dewsnap used to live right in here, and he had a chicken coop back here. And one Halloween, I let his chickens out. And a couple of days later, I was down and doing something, and I don't think you've ever seen a chicken catcher, but it's got a wooden handle, and it's a long piece of wire with a hook on it, and you can lay it on the ground and actually, you know, jig the leg of a chicken and catch it. Well, he came down in the yard and told, you know, Harry, they call my father Harry. Harry, he says, you seen any chickens? And my father said, no, Bill. He says, well, they let my chickens out on Halloween night. So he was looking for like 35 chickens. So I'm over there laughing. My old man came over and got a hold of me and whacked me up against a tree and said to me, guess who's gonna pay for the chickens if he doesn't find them? You go help him find his chickens. That was the end of that joke.
That's it for this edition. We'll be back next month with another edition of Reading at Large. Thanks for watching.